The obese bride fell from the wagon. The lone Apache lifted her without a word. The sun was merciless that day, carving the desert trail into a ribbon of light so bright it seemed to hum. The wagon train moved slow, each wheel creaking beneath the weight of wooden crates, water barrels, and human weariness. Among the travelers was Clara Wynne, the bride everyone whispered about, the one whose dress didn't fit the story people liked to tell about frontier women. Her cheeks flushed red from the heat, her breath shallow under the corset she'd insisted on wearing, despite the journey. When the wheel hit a rut, the wagon jolted hard, and she tumbled from the back before anyone could shout. Dust rose in a golden cloud around her as the wagon rolled on, the driver too tired to notice until someone yelled. The other women gasped. The men hesitated, glancing to see who would help first, their eyes full of judgment more than concern. "She's fine," one said, half laughing. "Just too heavy for her own seat." Clara tried to stand, her hands sinking into the dirt, but her ankle twisted beneath her, pain shooting up her leg. She looked around, eyes stinging, not just from dust, but from the way no one moved closer. Her hair, once carefully pinned, now clung to her face. "Please," she whispered. But the word vanished in the wind. Then, through the shimmering heat, came a figure from the rear of the caravan, a lone Apache scout who had been hired to guide them through the passes. His name was Tohani, though most called him the Quiet One. He approached without a word, the sunlight catching the edges of his dark braids, his stride steady and sure. The murmurs around them fell silent as he reached her side. Clara tried to pull away, pride flaring even through the pain. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled. Tohani said nothing. He crouched, his shadow falling over her, and with a single motion he lifted her from the ground. His arms, scarred and strong from years of survival, held her as if she weighed no more than the memory of what had been broken. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The wagon master muttered something about propriety, but the Apache ignored him. He carried her to the wagon's shade, set her down gently on a folded blanket, and checked her ankle with quiet precision. Clara stared at him, confused by the calm in his expression. No pity, no mockery, just an unspoken respect that stripped her shame bare. "Why?" she asked softly. He looked at her then, his eyes deep as the earth, and said the first words anyone had heard from him all week. "Because you fell," he said simply, and then stood, turning back toward the trail before anyone else found their courage. The moment lingered like a brand. Clara sat there, clutching her skirts, the dust still floating around her like judgment turned to gold. For the first time in her life, she had been lifted without being measured. By late afternoon, the sun had softened to copper, and the wagons had stopped to make camp near a dry riverbed where mesquite trees offered thin slices of shade. Clara sat apart from the others, her injured ankle wrapped in linen by the preacher's wife, though every glance cast in her direction carried more ridicule than pity. A few women whispered about how it wasn't right for an Apache to touch a white bride, while the men pretended not to listen but smirked anyway. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the slow spin of dust motes caught in the sunset. The shame was worse than the pain. It sat heavy in her chest, pressing harder with each breath. She'd grown up believing that dignity meant silence, but silence now felt like burial. The quiet around her deepened until she realized she wasn't alone. Tohani stood a few yards away, crouched near a dying campfire, sharpening his knife with rhythmic precision. The sound, stone against steel, was steady, almost musical. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, and somehow that made her want to. "You shouldn't have helped me," she said finally, her voice brittle but brave. He paused, glancing at her over his shoulder. "Shouldn't?" She swallowed. "They think less of me now." His gaze lingered for a heartbeat before returning to the blade. "They already did." She flinched, not from cruelty in his tone, but from how true it sounded. "You don't say much," she murmured after a moment. "You talk enough for both," he said. It wasn't unkind. It almost sounded like humor, dry and careful. For a moment she thought she saw a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth. The air between them shifted. Clara looked away, embarrassed by how much she wanted him to speak again. "You shouldn't sit alone," he said finally. "Coyotes move close after sundown." "I'm not afraid." "Then you're the only one here who isn't." He rose slowly, moving with quiet balance, and began stacking stones into a small circle. "Fire," he explained, lighting kindling with a flint spark that danced like a captured star. "It keeps what hunts away." "Even shame?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. The fire caught, spreading orange across his face, and she saw how tired he looked. Not from labor, but from carrying a kind of loneliness no one dared to name. She wanted to thank him again, but gratitude felt too small for what he had given her. He had lifted her in front of everyone, yet somehow made her feel less seen, not more exposed. "What tribe are you from?" she asked. "From no one now," he said. "The army made sure of that." His words fell heavy, unembellished, like stones dropped into still water. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be. You didn't light the fire." The conversation died there, but not the connection that had quietly taken root between them. As night settled, the camp dimmed except for their shared flame. Clara drew her shawl tighter, watching him as he sat cross-legged, motionless except for the subtle rise and fall of his chest. The silence wasn't awkward. It was steady, respectful, the kind that lets two wounded spirits recognize each other without need for speech. When the preacher's wife called for prayers, Tohani stood, poured sand on the flame, and walked toward the darkness beyond the wagons. Before he vanished into the night, he turned slightly toward her. Just enough for the firelight to catch his eyes. "Sleep," he said. "Tomorrow the trail climbs." She wanted to ask him how he knew her ankle would hold, how he carried such calm when the world looked at him like dust, but he was already gone, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and the strange feeling that she had been seen for the first time. Not as weight, not as ridicule, but as a person still worth protecting. The morning rose pale and brittle, the sky washed clean of clouds but streaked with that white haze that warned of heat yet to come. The wagons creaked back into motion, wheels grinding against the dry stone path, as if the earth itself resented being crossed again. Clara sat inside her wagon with her ankle bound tight, the fabric cutting slightly into swollen skin, each bump a reminder of the fall that had marked her in more ways than one. People no longer spoke directly to her, though she could feel their whispers slide through the air like gnats. "Too proud to ask for help," one said. "Should have stayed east," another muttered. She stared ahead, trying to fix her gaze on the horizon where the land shimmered gold and blue like a mirage. But every time the wagon hit a rut, her eyes darted to the figure riding a little behind the train, the lone Apache on horseback, silent as smoke, watching everything but saying nothing. He had taken the rear guard again, as if his duty were less to guide them than to guard the one they had shunned. Around midday, the caravan stopped for water at a narrow stream that trickled between pale stones. Clara stepped down carefully, refusing help from the others, but when her foot hit uneven ground, she stumbled again, catching herself on a low branch. The men near the horses chuckled under their breath. "Careful, missus," one said. "Can't have the wagon needing 2 wheels replaced." The laughter came easy to them. She forced a smile she didn't feel and limped toward the water, sitting alone near the edge. Her reflection stared back at her. A face flushed, hair damp, eyes tired but still defiant. She cupped water in her palms and let it fall through her fingers, watching the ripples erase the image. When she looked up, Tohani stood across the stream, filling a water skin. He hadn't made a sound. "You walk on that ankle again," he said. "You'll lose it." She stiffened. "And if I don't walk, they'll say I'm useless." "They already do." The way he said it, calm and matter-of-fact, made her want to laugh and cry in the same breath. "Doesn't it bother you?" she asked. "The way they look at you?" He tied the water skin shut and stood, his height framed by the light cutting through the canyon walls. "They don't see me," he said. "They see what they were told to hate." She wanted to argue, to say that wasn't true, but she couldn't. Not when she knew the same thing had been done to her. "Then why stay?" she asked quietly. "Because you can't guide what you abandon," he said. The words sank deep. He walked closer, crossing the shallow stream in 3 steps, the water rising around his boots. "The trail ahead is steep," he said. "Your wagon won't make it without balance." She frowned. "And you're offering to help?" "I already did," he said. "You fell." She stared at him, unsure whether he was mocking her or reminding her of something sacred. His eyes held no humor, only that steady patience she was beginning to recognize as his way of speaking without words. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and nodded towards the trail. "Rest till sundown. The rocks hold the day's anger. Let them cool before you climb." He turned to leave, but she called after him, "Why do you care what happens to me?" He stopped, glancing back over his shoulder. "Because you're still asking why," he said, and walked away before she could reply. For a long time she sat there, the wind playing with the edges of her shawl, and thought about what it meant to be lifted not for beauty, not for pity, but because someone refused to look away. That evening when the train moved again, she caught herself scanning the shadows behind them until she found him there, keeping his distance but never far enough to forget. By the time the sun fell behind the red cliffs, the wind had turned sharp and restless, carrying sand that hissed across the canvas wagons like whispers made of grit. The travelers gathered around the evening fire, their faces painted in amber light and judgment, voices rising in laughter that had little warmth. Clara sat apart again, pretending to mend a torn hem, while her fingers shook from exhaustion. Her ankle had begun to heal, but the ache never truly left. It pulsed each time she tried to prove she didn't need help. The men nearby were talking about her. She could tell by the way their laughter broke into low chuckles and sideways glances. "That Apache's got himself a soft heart for heavy loads," one said. "Or maybe he's just collecting strays." The others laughed, careless and cruel. Clara froze, her needle pausing mid-stitch. Heat crawling up her neck. She wanted to shout, to throw the needle into the fire, but her pride held her silent. Across the circle, Tohani sat alone, sharpening an arrowhead, his face calm but unreadable. He heard everything. They all knew he did, but he never reacted. That silence unnerved the men more than anger ever could. One of them, bolder after drink, stood and kicked dirt toward the fire. "Hey, Scout," he called, voice thick with mockery. "How's the bride's ankle? Think she'll walk down your trail next?" The laughter that followed was sharp enough to cut. Clara looked up, eyes burning, but Tohani didn't move. He finished tying his arrow, set it down carefully beside him, and only then raised his gaze. The fire caught the reflection in his eyes. Steady, unblinking, ancient. Without a word, he stood and crossed the circle. Each step deliberate, measured. The man who'd spoken shifted uneasily, his grin faltering. Tohani stopped in front of him, so close the air seemed to still. "You talk much," he said softly, "for someone who's never walked alone." The drunk tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "It's a joke," he muttered. "You should laugh more, Apache." Tohani's expression didn't change. "Then tell one worth laughing at." He turned away, ending the moment not with threat, but with dignity so absolute it silenced the entire camp. Clara watched, breath caught somewhere between fear and awe. The fire crackled, filling the space his words had left. When he passed her, she whispered, "Thank you." He paused, not looking at her. "For what?" "For not letting them make me smaller." His eyes flicked toward her, and she saw something there. Respect, maybe sorrow. "You did that yourself," he said quietly. "You stood. Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness beyond the fire's reach." The rest of the camp fell into uneasy silence, each person pretending to find interest in their supper or the stars. Clara sat for a long time, watching the flames twist and break, thinking about the strange balance between mercy and pride. When she finally rose, the firelight shimmered on her face, softening the lines of shame into something stronger. For the first time since the fall, she didn't feel heavy. She felt anchored, to the ground, to her breath, to the quiet proof that dignity could survive even in dust. As the night deepened, she turned toward the dark hills and whispered to the wind, "Let them talk. I'll keep walking." Somewhere out there, unseen, she thought she heard a horse's soft steps moving in rhythm with her resolve. At dawn, the sky was the color of tin, heavy and waiting, the smell of rain coiling through the canyon like something alive. The caravan moved slower than usual, the air thick with the promise of storm. Clara sat at the edge of her wagon, her ankle better now, but her pride tender as ever, watching Tohani ride ahead. The talk from the night before had settled into an uneasy silence. No one dared mock her again, not after the way the Apache had silenced their laughter with calm and truth sharper than any blade. She hadn't seen him since then, yet his words echoed every time she looked at her hands. "You stood." The trail narrowed between rock walls carved by centuries of water, forcing the wagons into single file. The sky darkened, the light turning greenish, and the first drops began to fall, soft, hesitant, then sudden and wild. The rain came fast, drumming on the canvas, soaking through seams and seams of old fabric until the wagons glistened like beasts of burden. Mud swallowed boots, horses balked, and someone shouted that the slope ahead was flooding. Clara gripped the wagon frame, the wheels slipping as the driver tried to steer through the torrent. She saw the water rising, a brown river forming where there had been only dirt. Panic rippled through the travelers. "Get the animals higher!" "Cut the rope! Save the wagon!" someone screamed, and Clara realized too late that the rear wheel had struck a hidden rock. The wagon tilted violently. She fell again, her body plunging into cold mud that swallowed her skirt and dragged her down. The current was small but merciless, pulling her toward the edge where the road broke into a ravine. She tried to grab something, anything, but the ground gave way beneath her. Then a hand caught her wrist, strong and certain, pulling her back from the brink. She gasped, looking up into Tohani's face streaked with rain and earth. He said nothing, his expression steady, his muscles straining as he hauled her to firmer ground. The world roared around them, the storm loud enough to drown every fear except the one in her chest that whispered she didn't deserve to be saved twice by the same man. When her feet hit solid earth again, she clung to him instinctively. His chest rose and fell against hers, and for a breathless moment they stood like that, the rain washing everything else away. She pulled back, finally, embarrassed. But he didn't move. "You always fall," he said quietly, the faintest trace of humor softening his voice. "And you always lift me," she replied. "Maybe you fall so I remember how," he said. She blinked, unsure whether he meant himself or her, but the words stuck deep. Around them, the others shouted and scrambled to salvage what they could, yet none dared speak of what they saw. Tohani turned toward the broken wagon, helping the men right it as if nothing had happened. Clara followed, limping but resolute, refusing to hide behind shame anymore. The rain softened to drizzle, the canyon filled with mist, and for a moment the world felt new, like it was learning to forgive itself. When the storm finally passed, the travelers gathered what was left of their supplies and built a fire on higher ground. Clara sat near the flames, her hair damp, her clothes clinging heavy, but her spirit lighter than she could remember. Tohani stood apart, wringing water from his braid, his silhouette sharp against the gray horizon. She wanted to speak, to thank him properly, but he looked at her just once, nodded, and walked into the fog without a sound. And somehow, that silence was the kindest thing anyone had ever given her. When the storm broke for good, the sky turned a bruised blue-gray that bled into evening, and the air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings that no one dared name. The wagons had stopped at a ridge overlooking the valley, where steam still rose from the soaked soil, curling like ghosts over the campfires. The travelers moved slower now, their arrogance drowned somewhere in the flood, their laughter replaced by quiet that sounded like apology, but never reached the tongue. Clara sat on a fallen log near the edge of camp, her dress still wet, her hair braided back roughly, her hands stained with ash from helping rebuild what the storm had taken. She no longer waited for others to speak to her. The shame that once hung like a chain now felt lighter, burned away by rain and silence. Across the camp, Tohani knelt near the horses, checking hooves for stones, his movements patient, deliberate. She hadn't spoken to him since the storm, though her eyes had searched for him each dawn and found him every time. Never near, never far, always enough to remind her that she wasn't invisible. The preacher's wife brought her a bowl of stew, her voice soft but hesitant. "You're lucky he was close." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe I was meant to fall." The woman frowned, confused. "You shouldn't say things like that." But Clara wasn't sorry. She meant it. Every fall had brought her nearer to truth. When the woman left, Clara stood and limped toward the horses. Tohani looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "You should rest," he said. "I've done enough resting," she replied, folding her arms. "If I rest any more, they'll start calling me useless again." He wiped his hands on a cloth, the faintest smirk flickering across his face. "Let them. Their words are wind." "And yours?" she asked quietly. "Mine are stone," he said, "but I use them sparingly." She laughed before she could stop herself, the sound surprising them both. "You should laugh more," he said softly. "You sound alive when you do." Her cheeks warmed, and she looked down, kicking at a pebble. "Why do you help me?" He paused, considering. "Because no one helped me when I fell." She looked up sharply. "You?" He nodded once. "There was a time before the army came, before silence became safer than truth. I learned then, when no one lifts you, you learn to lift others." His tone was steady, but there was pain buried under it, the kind that builds walls instead of breaking them. She wanted to say something comforting, something that could return the mercy he had given her, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, she reached out and touched his wrist lightly, a gesture so small it might have been nothing, and yet it made him still completely. His eyes met hers, steady as ever. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." "You were never hidden," he said, "just ignored." The quiet between them deepened until even the fire seemed to hush. Then a voice broke through the dark, the wagon master calling for everyone to prepare for night travel. Scouts had seen smoke to the east, bandits, maybe worse. Panic stirred again. Clara felt it spread through the camp like fever. "Will they come?" she asked. "If they're hungry," Tohani said. "Fear feeds them better than gold." He slung his rifle over his shoulder and started towards the ridge, but she followed. "You'll fight?" "I'll stand," he said. "That's all any man can do." She wanted to follow, but he turned, his tone firm but gentle. "Stay near the light. It listens better than darkness." She nodded, watching as he disappeared into the trees, his figure swallowed by moonlight and mist. The night stretched long, filled with rustling and rumor, and though fear lingered at the edges, Clara sat beside the fire and kept it burning bright, because somewhere out there she knew he was standing, for her, for everyone, for the kind of mercy that needs no witness to matter. The first shot came just before dawn, a sharp crack that split the valley silence in two, followed by the distant thunder of hooves and a woman's scream. The camp exploded into chaos, men shouting, children crying, horses rearing against their tethers. Clara woke with her heart slamming, the echo of fear shaking her from sleep before she could find her bearings. Smoke drifted low from the dying campfires, mingling with dust and gunpowder. "Bandits!" someone yelled. "Circle the wagons!" The air filled with panic. Clara stumbled out of her tent, clutching her shawl as the wagon master ran past, barking orders no one seemed to hear. Shots echoed again, closer now, the sound bouncing off the cliffs like a storm trying to find a place to land. She turned toward the ridge where Tohani had disappeared hours before, her chest tightening with dread. Then she saw him, charging down the slope on horseback, rifle in hand, moving with that fierce, quiet precision that made chaos look almost deliberate. He shouted something in Apache, a sound that carried more command than any English word could hold. The bandits came fast, lean and desperate men on half-starved horses, firing wildly into the camp. Tohani dismounted before his horse even stopped moving, rolling behind a fallen wagon, returning fire with calm, measured shots. His movements were fluid, without hesitation, without fear. The other men, driven more by confusion than courage, took cover wherever they could. Clara dropped beside one of the overturned barrels, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She could hear bullets whistling past, the screams of the wounded, the panicked neigh of a dying horse. Somewhere behind her, a man shouted for her to hide, but she didn't move. Through the smoke, she saw one of the bandits break away from the fight and gallop toward the line of wagons, his gun aimed low. Her wagon. Her chest went cold. Without thinking, she ran, ignoring the pain that shot through her ankle, her skirts gathering dust and blood. The bandit fired once, splintering the wood near the wagon's front wheel. Before he could aim again, Tohani appeared out of the haze, tackling the man clean from his saddle. The two fell hard, grappling in the mud. Clara froze, helpless as the struggle twisted and turned, Tohani's knife flashing once, the bandit's gun falling into the dirt. Then it was over. The man went still, the fight leaving him like air from a punctured drum. Tohani stood slowly, his chest heaving. Eyes fixed on the smoke where the last bandits fled. The camp was a ruin of torn canvas and scattered belongings, the survivors gathering in stunned silence. Clara limped toward him, her heart still galloping. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the blood on his arm. "Not enough to matter," he replied. "You shouldn't have run toward the fight." "And you shouldn't have stayed alone," she countered. He looked at her then, rain or sweat glistening on his brow, something unreadable flickering behind his calm. "You think I was alone?" She faltered, unsure how to answer. The air smelled of ash and iron, of mourning after fear. "You could have let them take what they wanted," she said. "It's what everyone else did." He shook his head. They weren't after things. They were after who'd break first. He looked at her ankle, at the dirt-streaked hem of her dress. "You didn't?" She felt tears rise, unbidden. "Maybe because you were watching." "No," he said softly. "Because you learned to stand even when I wasn't." Around them, the first rays of dawn pierced the smoke, painting the wreckage gold. Clara realized the battle had ended, the bandits gone, leaving behind nothing but silence and the scent of survival. The others began to emerge, faces pale, eyes wide with something that looked like shame. They looked at Tohani differently now, not as an outsider, not as a guide, but as the man who had saved them all. He holstered his rifle and turned to leave before gratitude could turn to words. But Clara stepped forward. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To see if the trail is clear," he said. "And if it isn't?" He glanced back once, his voice quiet but steady. "Then I'll make it so." By the time night fell again, the valley had gone eerily still, as if the land itself was trying to forget the violence that had passed through it. The survivors had moved the wagons into a circle, patching what they could, burying what they couldn't. Smoke from the evening fires rose into a starless sky, thick and slow, and the only sound was the low murmur of people too tired to talk. Clara sat by one of the smaller fires, her hands trembling as she cleaned a scrape on her forearm with a strip of cloth. Every motion ached, but the ache made her feel real. Across the circle, Tohani crouched near a dying flame, mending the strap of his rifle with deliberate care, his sleeves rolled up to the elbow. His arm was still bleeding through a bandage someone else had wrapped badly, yet he didn't seem to notice. The others kept their distance, unsure whether to thank him or fear him, their gratitude caught in the same silence that had defined him since the start. Clara had watched him all day, the way he helped the wounded, gathered supplies, rebuilt without being asked. He had saved lives, hers included, yet acted as though nothing he'd done deserved attention. When the others began to drift into sleep, she rose and limped toward him, carrying a fresh strip of linen. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're still bleeding," she said. "It'll stop." "Not if you keep pretending it's nothing." He didn't move, so she knelt beside him, reaching for his arm. When her fingers brushed his skin, he flinched slightly, not from pain, but from the unfamiliarity of gentleness. She cleaned the wound carefully, her movements slow and steady. The firelight flickering across their faces. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, she whispered, "I never thanked you." "You did," he said. "You lived." She looked up at him, frustrated by his simplicity. "Is that what it takes for you to call something enough?" "It's what it takes to call it finished." His tone was calm, but something in his eyes shifted, something deeper than weariness. "You don't believe in finishing," she said. "You keep walking like you're still running from something." He looked into the fire, the light catching the scar along his jaw. Maybe I am. From what? She asked softly. From who I was before silence, he said, voice low. Before I learned that mercy makes enemies faster than war. The confession landed like a stone in still water. She didn't speak, afraid any word would break the fragile honesty between them. He continued after a moment, his voice quiet, deliberate. I saw my people burned for helping a wagon train once. My brother tried to stop them. They said mercy was rebellion. I learned that saving others often costs what's left of yourself. The fire cracked, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Clara swallowed, her throat tight. And yet you saved me. Maybe I was trying to save him, he said. Or maybe I was just tired of letting the cruel decide who deserves help. She finished tying the bandage, her hands shaking. You deserve to be more than what they took from you. And you, he said gently, deserve to be more than what they call you. The words pierced deeper than any wound. For the first time since the fall, she couldn't find a reply. He reached for her hand then, not to hold it, but to steady it where it trembled against his arm. When you fell, he said, I saw a woman fighting the world's weight with no one to lift it but herself. I knew that kind of fight. She felt the tears before she realized they'd come. And now? She whispered. Now you stand taller than any man here, he said simply. The firelight caught her face, and for a moment, the shame she'd carried since the first day of the journey burned away, replaced by something quieter and stronger, understanding. She looked at him through blurred eyes, her voice trembling. You never asked my name. You never asked if I needed it, he said. The night deepened around them, the fire burning low, their silence turning into something holy. When he finally stood, she did too. Where will you go when this is over? She asked. Where I'm not needed, he said. Then you'll never rest, she murmured. He looked at her, the faintest smile touching his lips. Neither will you. The caravan reached the settlement 2 days later, a small cluster of weathered buildings that clung to the foot of the mountains like they'd grown from the same stone. After weeks of dust, hunger, and danger, the travelers moved through its streets with the dazed disbelief of survivors. The preacher's wife crossed herself as she passed the church. A few men headed straight for the saloon, and children ran toward the well, laughing with voices that didn't yet know what fear costs. Clara rode in one of the last wagons, her eyes tracing the rooftops, the sight of civilization stirring emotions she couldn't name. Relief, yes, but also the quiet ache of knowing she had changed too much to fit back into walls that measured worth by how little they bent. When they stopped in the town square, people came out to stare. The sight of an Apache scout riding among the settlers drew murmurs from every porch. Why's he with them? Someone asked. Don't they know better? The wagon master cleared his throat and thanked Tohani with words that sounded polite but hollow. You've done your duty, son, he said. You can ride on now. Tohani nodded once. My trail ends here. He dismounted, tying his horse loosely to a post, then turned toward the mountain road without ceremony. Clara stepped down from the wagon, ignoring the ache in her ankle, her skirts brushing the dust. Wait, she called, her voice cutting through the murmurs. He stopped but didn't turn. You'll leave without goodbye? There are too many eyes here for goodbyes, he said. Then let them watch, she replied. He hesitated, then faced her. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, whispering. They'll say worse, he warned. They already have, she said. She walked closer, her chin lifted though her heart hammered. You saved them and they turned their backs. You saved me, and I won't. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. Regret, maybe pride. "You owe me nothing." "Then maybe I give because I want to," she said. "Is that allowed?" He looked at her for a long time, his silence louder than the crowd's muttering. "You'll have a hard life if you keep choosing what's right instead of what's safe," he said. "I've already had one," she replied, "but at least now I know who I am in it." She reached for his hand, and though he didn't pull away, he didn't close it either. The world around them felt suspended. The gossip, the noise, even the dust seemed to hold its breath. The preacher stepped forward. Voice strained. "Ma'am, best let him go. God's path divides for a reason." Clara turned to him, her voice calm but fierce. "Maybe God sent him to remind us we keep building those divides ourselves." The man fell silent. A few of the onlookers turned their faces away, ashamed. Others scowled. Tohani's gaze stayed on her, a faint glint of something she hadn't seen before. Peace. "You shouldn't fight their fights," he said. "Then who will?" she asked. The question hung unanswered. Finally, he reached up, touching the brim of his hat in quiet respect. "You'll be fine," he said. "You already are." "And you?" she whispered. "I walk," he said. "It's what I know." He turned then, leading his horse towards the open trail, his figure shrinking against the vastness beyond the town. She watched him until he became a moving shadow in the sun. The dust curling behind him like smoke, rising from something sacred. The preacher's wife came up beside her, whispering, "He'll forget you." Clara smiled faintly. "That's how I'll know he remembers." Then she turned back toward the town that had once promised safety, and saw only walls too small for what she'd become. The others would go on with their routines, pretending the world hadn't shifted, but she knew it had. She limped slowly towards the church door, pausing once to glance at the horizon where the lone Apache had vanished. Somewhere out there, he walked under open sky, and for the first time, she didn't envy his solitude. She honored it. Weeks passed before the dust of the wagon trail stopped haunting Clara's dreams, but the silence he left behind never faded. The town had settled into its old rhythm, the clang of hammers at dawn, the church bell's tired echo, the same faces trading gossip about the woman who'd been saved by an Apache and didn't seem ashamed of it. She ignored them all. She worked in the bakery beside the well, her hands busy with dough, her thoughts somewhere on the ridges where the wind moved freely. The scars on her hands healed, the ache in her ankle faded, but the mark inside her stayed. A strange peace that made no sense in a life that had once been ruled by fear. Every morning she rose before the sun, not to pray, but to walk the edge of town, her boots tracing the wagon ruts that led toward the mountains. Sometimes she brought a loaf wrapped in cloth and left it by the old marker stone where his horse had once stopped for water, the gesture small but sacred. People whispered she was waiting for him to come back. Maybe she was, though waiting didn't feel like longing anymore. It felt like gratitude that had learned patience. One evening, a storm rolled across the horizon, lightning cutting jagged veins through the sky, and the townsfolk rushed indoors while she stayed by the door, watching the rain sweep across the plain. She thought of that first fall, the dust, the laughter, the hand that had lifted her without asking for thanks, and smiled through tears she didn't bother to hide. The storm passed quickly, leaving the air clear and sharp, the world rinsed of noise. As the last light drained from the sky, she saw movement near the far fence line, a shape too tall and steady to be illusion. Her heart lurched, but she didn't move, afraid hope might dissolve if she reached for it too fast. The figure stopped at the edge of town, rain glinting off a dark braid. He didn't approach, didn't call her name. He just stood there, as if making sure the world still held its shape. When he turned to leave, she whispered, "Thank you," though the distance swallowed the words. It didn't matter. He didn't need to hear them to know. The next morning, the townspeople found footprints leading away from the fence, long strides heading toward the high pass, and beside them, a smaller set walking for a while before turning back. Clara never explained, and no one asked again. Life resumed its slow, stubborn pace, but her quiet became its own sermon. She worked. She laughed. She stood taller. When travelers came through and spoke of an Apache who rode alone along the river trails, she'd smile and pass them bread, saying only, "Then the path's still good." Years later, when children asked why her bakery was called the Wagon's Mercy, she'd tell them the story not as a tale of romance or rescue, but of the day she learned that grace doesn't shout. It simply kneels, lifts, and walks away. They'd listen wide-eyed, and she'd end every telling the same way, looking toward the mountains where the clouds gathered like memory. The world judged him by his silence, she'd say softly, but that's where his truth lived. On the last morning of her life, old and content, Clara woke before dawn, baked her bread, and left one loaf by the marker stone again. The sunrise touched the peaks in fire, the same light that had once fallen on dust and mercy. A traveler passing by found her there hours later, sitting with her hands folded, eyes open to the horizon. He told people later she looked like she was listening to something far away. Maybe she was. Maybe it was the echo of hooves on the wind, or a voice that had never needed words to speak. Either way, the road beyond the town stayed open that day, the trail unbroken, and in the hush between sunlight and dust, it seemed the world finally understood what she had known all along, that sometimes love isn't claimed, it's carried, and that mercy, once given, never truly leaves. If this story touched something quiet inside you, let it linger. Please like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of the West, where every story remembers the ones who were lifted, not because they were perfect, but because they were human. Tell us in the comments. Do you think mercy means walking away or staying until you're seen?